Chen Ping'an imperceptibly dug the tips of his feet into the ground, and it was as if he were familiarizing himself with his legs that had become lighter. He was observing Ma Kexuan the entire time, and he noticed that Ma Kexuan had picked up 5 stones, with 4 in his left hand and 1 in his right. Ma Kexuan appeared calm and composed as she looked at the young girl from the outside world, whose sword and saber scabbards were both empty at this moment. He smiled and said, "Let me get this straight first. This is a battle between me and Chen Ping'an. And based on the stories that my grandma used to tell me when I was little, generals shouldn't call their underlings for help when they're dueling one-on-one. Whoever calls for reinforcements is a coward. If a general can slay their foe, then they'll greatly increase the morale of their side, and they would have essentially won the battle. Ning Yao couldn't help but feel annoyed as she looked at Ma Kexuan. She had never seen such a punchable person before. Even though Clayface Ali Song Jixon was also scheming and liked to show off his knowledge, he at least looked like a young scholar. Meanwhile, the young boy in front of them was skinny and short, and his skin was also tanned and no lighter than Chen Ping'an's. His eyes were also especially large, and this made him look extremely strange and uncanny. Add to that his strange logic and reasoning, and he seemed much like an old woman who had poured half a pound of makeup onto their face and was purposely trying to act bashful and seductive. This was truly a terrifying sight. Chen Ping'an didn't utter any threats to Ma Kexuan, and he simply bent down slightly before suddenly exploding forward, with his speed as quick as a galloping horse as he charged at the young boy from Apricot Blossom Alley. So fast. Ning Yao gazed at Chen Ping'an's sprinting figure. In just the blink of an eye, he had already shot out more than 6 meters. She had seen and experienced many things before, but Ning Yao still couldn't help but exclaim in emotion. This naturally wasn't to say that Chen Ping'an was peerless among those at his age simply because he could sprint faster than foxes and rabbits. Instead, she admired him because he was able to work hard for a dozen or so years to temper his physique to such a level in this small world that was akin to a prison. Ning Yao pondered over this thought was being able to endure hardships or show talent. The distance between Chen Ping'an and Ma Kexuan was quickly halved. In fact, Chen Ping'an could already see the slight changes in Ma Kexuan's expression. There was a brief moment of astonishment, followed by a brief moment of fear, which rapidly disappeared and was replaced by an expression of calm and composure. Ma Kexuan then quickly raised an arm without any hesitation, with his thin limb unleashing an astonishing burst of explosive power. Chen Ping'an had been staring at Ma Kexuan's right hand the entire time, and he decided not to continue in a straight line anymore. Instead, leaning toward the right, Ma Kexuan's elbow surprisingly paused for a moment, and with a flick of his wrist, a stone shot toward the tinning Chen Ping'an. The stone possessed a ferocious might, and even though it wasn't as terrifying as the old age attacks, it was still something that Chen Ping'an needed to tread with caution. He should have been affected by the attack, but Chen Ping'an didn't grind to a halt. With a twist of his hips, his upper body leaned to the side, causing the stone to flash past his eyes. The strands of hair on his forehead were blown up by the gust of wind created by the stone. Ma Kexuan flicked his left hand where he held the remaining stones, tossing one of them into his right hand. It seemed like he also knew that he couldn't dispose of Chen Ping'an with this second attack, so he decided not to remain in the same spot. He stood up and ran to his right, throwing the stone at Chen Ping'an at the same time. Chen Ping'an suddenly leaned down, with his hands almost able to touch the ground. The stone shot over his back, ripping his thin shirt. Fortunately, this was only a graze. Even though the wound looked bloody and frightening, it actually wasn't very deep. The distance between them halved again. At this moment, Ma Kexuan also realized that he should retreat and increase the distance between them. However, Chen Ping'an was far too quick. So much so that Ma Kexuan's hurried retreat appeared slow and clumsy in comparison. As Chen Ping'an drew closer, his resolute and clear gaze also became increasingly piercing. In contrast, a hint of hesitation flashed across Ma Kexuan's eyes. Should he abandon this opportunity to attack and retreat instead? Or should he gamble everything on this third attack and have it determine the outcome of the fight? There was a clear juxtaposition between Ma Kexuan's hesitation and Chen Ping'an's resoluteness. At this moment, did Chen Ping'an still look like a foolishly kind young boy from Clay Vase Alley? In this moment of life and death, Ma Kexuan took a step back and swung his arm. It was clear that he believed in his own abilities, though to say nothing of fighting with others. This reclusive young boy had never even argued with others before. Ever since he was little, he had never liked to hang out with others at his age. For example, Chen Ping'an and Gokan. He appeared more like a wild cat who liked to run around by himself. When he became bored, he liked to grab a handful of stones and throw them as he walked. Of course, he would throw them very lightly, and it would look like he was simply playing. Thus, no one took this seriously. However, when Ma Kexuan was alone on the banks under the covered bridge, he would skip stones across the surface of the water using slightly flatter stones. He could often have them skip more than a dozen times and strike the bottom surface of the stone arch bridge on the opposite bank, causing them to shudder. This was a clear indication of the dexterity of his hands and the power of his arms. Ma Kexuan would often squat on top of the azure cow ridge as well, using stones to strike the fish in the water. Regardless of whether these stones hit their target or not, they would almost never cause a splash. As a result, there would often be the mangled corpses of several birds lying on the roof or in the courtyard of that residence in Apricot Blossom Alley. There were only a dozen or so meters left between Chen Ping'an and Ma Kexuan. When dodging Ma Kexuan's two attacks just then, Chen Ping'an's movements could be described as more on the side of agile and light. He hadn't revealed any powerful muscles or limbs, and he was instead like a fluttering leaf. However, when Chen Ping'an and Ma Kexuan were about to collide, Chen Ping'an finally revealed his powerful side. He took 3 large strides that were both aggressive and powerful, with his feet appearing like hammers striking iron billets when they landed, and appearing like claws that could lift mountains when they rose. After these 3 large strides, the 2 young boys were almost face to face. Ma Kexuan didn't have enough time to throw another stone. Logically speaking, he had already lost his best opportunity. However, Chen Ping'an's heart suddenly jolted at this moment, though he still didn't choose to retreat. This was because his momentum was far too great, making it impossible for him to come to a sudden stop. Since this was the case, he was better off leaping forward and taking a gamble. The corners of Ma Kexuan's mouth curled up into a smile as he unclenched his left hand and discarded the remaining stones. His right hand was already clenched into a fist, so he immediately stepped forward and drew a punch. He had been laying a trap for Chen Ping'an since the very beginning. His hesitation, his allowing Chen Ping'an to draw closer, and even his choice to attack Chen Ping'an with stones, all of these were part of Ma Kexuan's meticulous plan. He was purposely appearing weak to his enemy, and his aim was to draw the slimy boy who could escape from the old ape to his side. He was luring Chen Ping'an over on purpose. A distance of 1 arm was a distance of 1 punch. Chen Ping'an was left-handed, though this wasn't especially evident. Thus, his left fist forcefully collided together with Ma Kexuan's right fist. As their fists collided, both of them raised their legs and kicked each other at almost the exact same moment. Chen Ping'an and Ma Kexuan both flew back before heavily thumping to the ground. The distance between them grew to 20 or so meters again. Ma Kexuan picked himself up, kneeling on 1 knee as he sucked in deep breaths. He raised his arm and unclenched his right fist. This was because he hadn't thrown the final stone. Thus, even though his palm couldn't be described as bloody and mangled, the wound on it was still sanguine red and frightening. Ma Kexuan grimaced as he rubbed his stomach. There was fervor in his eyes, and he roared with laughter as he said, "Chen Ping'an, dare to exchange another blow." Chen Ping'an's left hand was in an even more miserable state. This was because a deep gash had been left on his palm by that shard of porcelain when he had killed Xianxia in the small alley. Even though he applied the secret herbal ointment from the young family's medicine shop every day, such severe wounds usually needed around 100 days to fully heal. Regardless of how tough Chen Ping'an's physique was, he wasn't a powerful god or immortal. After all, thus, he had definitely suffered more during the exchange with Ma Kexuan. Wrapped in cotton strips, Chen Ping'an's left hand was already involuntarily shaking. Blood seeped through the cotton strips and dripped onto the wild grass beside his feet. Chen Ping'an forced himself to take a deep breath, and this made him clearly feel the piercing pain traveling over from his abdomen. He needed to determine how much this pain would affect him in the coming exchanges. He was doing this out of habit. Chen Ping'an was born into an impoverished family, and it was exactly because he had far too few possessions that he was always so stingy about everything. In contrast, those born into rich families like Shuang Jixen and Liu Jiangchun would never care about how many copper coins they had in their pockets. They cared about the bigger picture, so they cared less about these trivial matters. However, Chen Ping'an naturally couldn't do this. Thus, the impression that Chen Ping'an gave others was that he was an extremely cautious person who was slightly indecisive, but also very good at enduring things. Meanwhile, he didn't appear very lively and ambitious like the other youths. As for Ma Kexuan, who had mysteriously run over to fight with him, he could most likely be regarded as a strange and eccentric person who was also very unreasonable. Ning Yao could still be described as sharp and unyielding. At least, Ma Kexuan was someone who would leave others scratching their heads. Chen Ping'an didn't turn around, and he waved a hand at Ning Yao with his back facing her, signifying that he was okay. Ma Kexuan slowly stood up, grabbing a handful of weeds. As he did so, he then casually wiped away the blood on his palm. Chen Ping'an also stood up. Ma Kexuan dashed forward first, with his explosive power so great that he left the pits where he had stood just then. Ma Kexuan, who looked like a skinny monkey, was unfathomably quick as he dashed forward and leapt into the air, with his knee slamming down at Chen Ping'an. Chen Ping'an slammed his fist into Ma Kexuan's flying knee. However, the lunging Ma Kexuan also leaned forward and drew a lightning-quick jab, striking Chen Ping'an on the forehead. At the same time, his bent knees instantly straightened and smashed into Chen Ping'an's chest. It was as if Chen Ping'an had suffered a hammer strike to his head and a sledgehammer to his chest, causing him to involuntarily fall backward. Ma Kexuan tumbled in the air before landing on his feet and continuing to dash forward with a wicked smile. He arrived before the half-squatting Chen Ping'an in no time, and he immediately launched another kick. Chen Ping'an raised his arms to block, with his left arm on the outside and his right arm on the inside. He stubbornly protected his face and chest. Chen Ping'an was sent flying by Ma Kexuan's kick. However, his center of gravity had been extremely low, and he had also protected his weak points, so the outcome wasn't a bloody and miserable one. He continued to tumble along the ground. Ma Kexuan didn't relent, and he continued to charge forward. When Chen Ping'an finally stopped rolling, he landed in a half-kneeling position with his knees bent and his body leaning forward, preparing him for a forward thrust. It was hard to say whether this was on purpose, though Ma Kexuan's expression faltered. In the next moment, Chen Ping'an shot forward like an arrow released the full draw, instantly arriving before Ma Kexuan. His speed was so quick that he seemed like a completely different person compared to just then, appearing weak to the enemy. Chen Ping'an also knew how to do this. Ma Kexuan didn't even have the time to throw a punch as Chen Ping'an thrust his shoulder into his chest. Ma Kexuan stumbled back, with another bout of agonizing pain traveling over from his stomach. He instinctively bent over, yet his left temple was immediately struck by Chen Ping'an's swinging forearm. The force of the strike so great that he was sent flying in a peculiar manner, with his feet trailing behind his body as he flew sideways. However, Chen Ping'an suddenly grabbed Ma Kexuan's feet before swinging him around in a full circle. With a furious roar, he then viciously threw the 90-pound young boy into the distance. Ma Kexuan flew toward the statue of a sitting god that was collapsed on one side. This statue was around 5 meters tall, and if things continued on the same trajectory, then Ma Kexuan would definitely suffer a very gruesome fate. However, Ma Kexuan didn't rely on any external help, as he created a surprise for himself. His feet landed on the head of the statue one before another, and he instantly bent his knees to absorb the impact before immediately straightening them again, causing him to shoot forward thanks to the huge rebounding momentum. He dashed toward his opponent in the distance. This was extremely similar to what Chen Ping'an had done just then. However, Ma Kexuan's eyes suddenly widened in shock and terror, What greeted him was the sight of Chen Ping'an standing there, with one arm raised and holding a short dagger that had seemingly appeared out of nowhere. The tip of the blade was directly pointing at the fast-arriving macaque Xuan. When people added the word seeking death, this was probably the kind of situation they were talking about. None. Even though Chen Ping'an's arm was shaking violently, the way he held his dagger would still ensure that macaque Xuan's body was cleanly run through. The only difference would be whether the blade entered through his arm, head, or chest. Macaque Xuan was facing a perilous situation, and he was gripped with a sense of extreme shock and fear. However, he didn't have any intention of giving up. He twisted his body with great difficulty, determined to protect his vitals from the fast-approaching blade. Right at this moment, a tall figure appeared between Chen Ping'an and macaque Xuan. This was a middle-aged man with a sword strapped to his back and the tiger talisman tied to his waist. Chen Ping'an wasn't able to see what he did, but in a flash, macaque Xuan rotated in the air and landed on his feet, with his body fully upright as he stood beside the man. The man turned around to look at Chen Ping'an, who had taken a step back with the dagger still in his hand. There was unconcealed approval and appreciation in his eyes as he chuckled softly and said, "You both did quite well." Blood seeped from the corners of Chen Ping'an's mouth, and he took another step back. The man smiled when he saw this, and he said in suggestion, "Since I stepped in to save macaque Xuan, I'll repay you by doing you a favor. After I leave, I'll convince the mountain-moving ape from Sun-Scorched Mountain to abandon his pursuit of you too. How does that sound?" Ning Yao walked up beside Chen Ping'an. The martial artist from True Martial Mountain took a deep look at Ning Yao. He then turned to Chen Ping'an and said, "You don't have the right to bargain with me. I'll nod if you agree, and continue to remain silent if you disagree. If you feel like this is unfair, or if you feel wronged, or if you feel like you can get lucky and escape from the old ape, then you can come and look for me at True Martial Mountain in the future. You can ask for what you think is fair." Chen Ping'an put away the skirt dagger that Ning Yao had lent him, hiding it in his right sleeve. He then nodded at the man and said, "If I have the opportunity, I'll definitely go and look for you." Macaque Xuan was just about to speak, yet the man immediately cut him off with a cold expression, saying, "Dead people don't have the right to threaten living people." Macaque Xuan tightly pursed his lips, however. He really did lower his head and remain silent. The master and disciple from True Martial Mountain slowly disappeared into the distance. Chen Ping'an plunked down on the ground. Ning Yao hurriedly bent down and asked in concern, "How are you feeling? Where are you hurt the most? Will the prescription from Taoist Lu still be useful?" With his face battered and bruised and his body filled with internal injuries, Chen Ping'an wore a bitter expression as he replied, "It should be fine. At the very least, I can still tell what area hurts, which means that my wounds aren't too severe. That's right. If the old ape comes over at this moment, then we'll let him come over." Ning Yao also decided to sit down, a smile on her face as she said, "You were here to fight for us just then, so I'll also be here to fight for us at that time. What's there to be afraid of?" Chen Ping'an silently swallowed the second half of the sentence that he hadn't spoken yet. Ning Yao's smile suddenly became dazzling, and she raised her thumbs at Chen Ping'an and said, "That was very impressive." At this moment, the impoverished young boy, who had never viewed himself as impressive before, forcefully tried to contain his smile. He purposely tried to make himself appear more nonchalant and carefree. In reality, however, nothing could wipe the happiness from his face. The young boy felt extremely proud as he sat in the spring breeze, walking through the desolate mountains where foxes and rabbits thrived. The man with the sword strapped to his back suddenly stopped in front of a tombstone. He walked up beside the tombstone, which stood in front of a small dirt mound, and squatted down next to it, removing the weeds that were growing around it and revealing its true appearance. The characters on it had already become fuzzy, and only less than half of it could still be deciphered. The man sighed and said, "The divine Tao is collapsing, and the ritual and music system is flourishing. The battle between the 100 schools of thought is about to begin." When the man stood up, he saw that his disciple, who was still yet to become a formal disciple of True Martial Mountain, facing the direction that they had come from. Blood was seeping from macaque Xuan's mouth, ears, and nose, causing his tanned face to appear especially wicked and terrifying. He used his forearm to roughly wipe his blood away before continuing to stare in that direction. Macaque Swan, according to the excuse you gave me before, you wanted to head over there because of that young girl from the outside world. You told me that she teamed up with the prince and eunuch from Great Jian nation and used her flying sword to kill your first master. You told me that this left a note in your heart, so you needed to find her to exact revenge. I felt like your request was reasonable, so I didn't stop you from going. I allowed you to take control of your own life and death. After all, being able to encounter such down enemies is both a danger and an opportunity for us cultivators and martial artists. The man's voice became solemn, and he showed no signs of being lenient on his disciple, just because he was talented. However, you targeted the young boy from Clayface Alley instead, that why? I already told you before that martial artists from True Martial Mountain, especially swordsmen, definitely shouldn't attack and kill innocent people for no reason. Macaque Swan sidestepped the question, and he instead replied with a question of his own, asking, are martial artists most able to ignore karma and preordained fate? The man nodded and replied, casting one's gaze through several thousand years of history, those who are able to use their own strength to turn the tides of a time are indeed mostly sages from the martial sect. I am not saying this on purpose simply because I'm a martial artist as well. The man kept his gaze on Macaque Swan, not planning to let him shrug off his question. If Macaque Swan were a bloodthirsty person who enjoyed preying on the weak, why would he accept such a disciple for True Martial Mountain? In mortal empires, martial artists relied on fighting on the battlefields to raise their cultivation base. This was a dangerous method that kept them on a tightrope between life and death. Once they lost control of their true selves, it would be extremely easy for them to fall into demonic ways. At that time, just how easy would it be for these martial artists who held profound military power to massacre cities and destroy nations? The martial sect and the Confucian sect were the two towering pillars that held up the mortal empires and ensured peace. If a revered and powerful martial artist went down the wrong path, then the higher their cultivation base and the higher their position, the more damage they would be able to inflict on the mortal empire. There were many bloody lessons recorded in the history books. Just how difficult was it to win over public opinion? And just how easy was it to lose public opinion? Even though this was a remark made by a Confucian sage, there was no shortage of martial artists who had earnestly studied Confucian teachings. They all deeply agreed with this remark. Perhaps Macaque Swan noticed the increasingly heavy atmosphere. However, he wasn't in a hurry to explain himself, and he lightly cupped an ear with his hand. This strained his wound, and it instantly caused him to suck in a deep breath and grimace in pain. He relaxed for a moment before putting his hand down and looking at the puddle of blood on his palm. Only at this moment did he say, "He's called Chen Ping'an, and his father died when he was still very young, before he passed away. That man was a famous potter in the small town. He was extremely good at his craft, and he was also a very honest person. However, he sadly died one day, and his corpse was never found either. Even though my grandma never admitted to it, I can still clearly remember the booming thunder and pouring rain from that night. I was woken up by the thunder, and I discovered that my grandma wasn't by my side. When I opened the door a little, I saw my father stealthily running over with delight and fear on his face. That was a very strange expression. My mother kept patting him on the back, and she couldn't wipe the smile from her face. She was truly beside herself with delight. Macaque Swan unconsciously frowned as he tried to recall that bleak memory, and he continued, "Only my grandma remained silent, and she didn't look too happy either. Not only that, but she even scolded my father angrily, saying, 'Do you think she married you just because her husband died? Why don't you take a piece and use it as a mirror to look at yourself?' The Chen clan from Clayface Alley has only had a single child for many generations, so aren't you afraid of pushing all three of them to death? When this branch of the Chen clan vanishes because of you, aren't you afraid that their ancestral Yin god will look for you to seek revenge? Taking 10,000 steps back, are you truly not aware of that woman's personality? Are you not aware that she never remarried? My father wore a sheepish grin at that time, and he probably thought that he had committed to it already and was soon about to obtain his reward. So he didn't pretend to be remorseful or sorry. In the end, my grandma pointed at my mother and viciously scolded her. However, my mother doesn't have a good temper either, so the two of them almost got into a fight in the main hall. My father is the type of person who's fond of the new and tired of the old, so everyone in the neighborhood disliked him at the time. He naturally helped my mother instead of my grandma, and in the end, my grandma sat down on the floor and beat her chest in grief. She lamented to their plague as she cried, and she said that the Ma clan had accepted a huge troublemaker in my mother into the clan. She cursed them and said that they would die in discontent and regret. After listening to Ma Kaxuan's explanation, the man asked, "You want to collect the intangible karma from the evil deeds for yourself? You wish for your father and grandma to eventually die in peace?" Ma Kaxuan grinned and said, "I truly don't have any feelings toward my father and mother. However, I can't help but worry about my grandma. She's not willing to come to True Marshall Mountain with me, and she said that she definitely has to be buried next to Grandpa when she passes away. So, if she goes to the distant True Marshall Mountain, she definitely have to burden me with a trip back to the small town in the future. Moreover, she heard others say that one would have to traverse a difficult young path after they died, and she certainly didn't want to experience this after experiencing so many hardships while still alive." "That's understandable," the man said. "However, you're still in the wrong. Only this once and never again. Understood?" Ma Kaxuan pursed his lips, a cold expression on his face. He didn't shake his head and talk back, but he didn't nod and agree either. The man smiled and poured more salt on Ma Kaxuan's wounds, saying, "How did it feel to be held down and beaten by someone the same age as you? If Chen Ping'an hadn't pulled out a fucking dagger, how could I have lost to him?" Ma Kaxuan replied indignantly. "From the beginning to the end, I only used 70% of my strength. If I wasn't trying to toy with him. The man chuckled in ridicule and said, "Toy with him? Spare me. Was your plan not to kill him with 70% of your strength, so that the young girl would underestimate you, and then you could kill her as well afterward, hitting two birds with one stone? Quite ambitious of you." Ma Kaxuan's face flushed slightly red. However, he remained stubborn, and he said in anger, "Just whose master are you?" The man roared with laughter. The two of them set off again, heading toward the small town. Compared to Sun-Scorched Mountain, is True Marshall Mountain taller or shorter? Ma Kaxuan asked. The man smiled and replied, "Do you want to hear the truth or the lie?" Ma Kaxuan raised a brow and said, "What's the lie?" "They're around the same," the man replied. Ma Kaxuan sighed in grief, and he felt like he was truly unfortunate when it came to meeting new people. His first master had mysteriously died in Dragon Riding Alley, while his second master wasn't very powerful, yet had a whole heap of rules. The man smiled and continued, "On the surface, Sun-Scorched Mountain is one of the fundamental sects of Sword Dao. However, in the minds of cultivators from Eastern Treasure Vile Continent, its status is far inferior to that of its nemesis, One Lightning Field Dart. As a result, Sun-Scorched Mountain isn't regarded as a first-rate sect. Of course, this is only a false appearance, and in reality, Sun-Scorched Mountain has an incredibly strong foundation. It was only because of that conflict that they seem weaker than they are. At that time, there was a swordsman from One Lightning Field whose skill with the sword far exceeded the others in his generation. He was far too dazzling, and his brilliance forced Sun-Scorched Mountain to endure hundreds of years of humiliation. Double quotes. No matter how much you talk up Sun-Scorched Mountain, that still won't change the fact that True Marshall Mountain is inferior to them." Ma Kaxuan snapped. The man chuckled and said, "Ma Kaxuan, you're mistaken. The gulf between Sun-Scorched Mountain and True Marshall Mountain is approximately the size of another Sun-Scorched Mountain." Ma Kaxuan faltered upon hearing this, but he quickly understood the meaning behind these words. He immediately smiled and said, "That's more like it. The sect is the sect, and you are you." The man reminded the young boy. Ma Kaxuan chuckled and said, "You're also mistaken. What I mean is, since true martial mountain is so tall, it will be much easier for me to find people to spar with when I become more powerful in the future. At the very least, I won't be surrounded by a bunch of weaklings and fools. The man smiled in reply, saying, will these words be more persuasive if they're spoken by that young boy from Clayface Alley? Just what kind of master are you? Macaque Xian said in anger. Be careful that I won't exact revenge for you if you're killed in the future. The man reached behind himself and patted the scabbard of his sword, saying with a faint smile, apart from this sword, I have no other relatives. If I'm killed, what's the point of seeking revenge for me? Isn't this still true martial mountain? Macaque Xian asked with a puzzled expression. True martial mountain is different from the other sects in Eastern Treasure Vile Continent. You'll understand when you get there, the man said. The tiger talisman hanging by his waist shuddered softly. The man held his hand over for a brief moment before saying in a solemn voice, hurry, we need to return to the small town. We martial artists are able to seek fortune and avoid calamity, and we're also able to predict the near future. This is almost instinct for us. Macaque Xian rolled his eyes and said, even if the small town has descended into absolute chaos, with the outsiders and the residents fighting until a sea of blood forms, what has that got to do with me? Let me get this straight. I can agree to not kill innocent people, but I definitely won't go out of my way to help others either. The man wore a solemn expression as he grabbed Macaque Xian's shoulder and commanded, don't speak. Hold your breath. The two of them disappeared with a flash before immediately reappearing almost 50 meters away. This process repeated again and again, and their disappearing and reappearing motion appear much like the stones that Macaque Xian skipped across the creek. Apart from being grazed on the back by the stone thrown by Macaque Xian, Chen Ping'an hadn't actually suffered too many injuries. However, this definitely didn't mean that he felt fine and dandy at this moment. The most troublesome wound was still the one on his left palm, especially since he had slowed down its healing by submerging it in water while wading through the creek to collect snake gold pebbles and catch fish. Exchanging that punch with Macaque Xian just then had further exacerbated the problem. When Chen Ping'an removed the cotton strips, the only thing he could do was retrieve a porcelain bottle from the pouch on his waist and ingest its contents. This was naturally herbal medicine he had brewed according to the prescription that he had obtained from the Yang family's medicine shop all those years ago. Its only effect was to suppress pain. After taking back her ancient-looking skirt dagger, Ning Yao sliced a large strip of cloth from her sleeve and cut it into strips. After wrapping them around Chen Ping'an's wound, she asked the young boy who was drenched in a cold sweat, is the folk medicine from the Yang family's medicine shop really effective? Chen Ping'an lightly waved his left hand and squeezed out a smile, saying, it's very useful. I was genuinely in pain just then, and I've only experienced such agonizing pain 2 times before. Even the bones in your hand were visible. How could you not be in pain? Ning Yao scolded. Do you think you've attained the virile body of Buddha star heads, or perhaps the untainted physiques of Taoist true lords? Who forced you to act brave? Who forced you to fight Macaque Xian one-on-one? Didn't he want a duel? Sure thing. He can fight the 2 of us by himself. What's wrong with that? Even I don't find that embarrassing. Yet you've become addicted to playing the hero, haven't you? I know. Why don't you challenge the old ape from Sun-Scorched Mountain to a one-on-one battle as well? And I'll even continue to clap and cheer for you. Chen Ping'an was just about to interject and explain his reasoning to her. However, Ning Yao immediately glared at him, so he could only nod and say, yes, you're right, Ning Yao. Ning Yao shot a sideways glance at him, saying, your mind doesn't agree with your mouth. You think I don't know? Chen Ping'an chuckled upon hearing this. Meanwhile, his gaze remained fixed on the skirt dagger in her hands. At first glance, this skirt dagger appeared small and adorable upon closer inspection. However, one would realize that it was razor sharp and cold. Chen Ping'an felt like this skirt dagger was the complete opposite of its owner. Ning Yao told Chen Ping'an to raise his right arm, and she gently placed the skirt dagger back into the saber scabbard that was tied to his arm. Don't push your luck, and don't have any ulterior thoughts about this dagger, she said in warning. Ning Yao, you're overthinking things, Chen Ping'an replied in exasperation. Ning Yao suddenly pointed at the statue of the Taoist enforcer with broken arms and said, "Do you know what stone the ink-black statue base is cut and made from?" Chen Ping'an nodded and replied, "Of course I know." Ning Yao, you've asked the right person. If we follow the creek and venture deeper into the mountains, I estimate that we'll need to walk for at least half a day. We'll arrive in front of a black stone cliff that's entirely made from this kind of stone. It's extremely solid, and even striking it with a hammer won't cause any damage to it. That's to say nothing of striking it with a hatchet or something. There are also several grooves in the cliff face, and the stone is at a fairly large angle inside these grooves. They're not smooth or even either. Every time old man Yao and I walked past this place, he would get me to sharpen the hatchets on the cliff face. And let me tell you, the hatchets would surely become glistening after a good sharpening. They would appear completely different from before. Ning Yao pinched her brows, not knowing whether to laugh or to cry. Using it to sharpen hatchets for hacking trees and chopping firewood. Chen Ping'an's eyes lit up, and he exclaimed, "It's valuable. No matter how valuable it is. Are you able to obtain even a small piece of stone from that large cliff face?" Ning Yao said with a huff, "I'm telling you, even ordinary immortals can't do that. Of course, that's unless they're a powerful sword immortal who's also willing to sacrifice a divine weapon. If that's the case, they might be able to hike off to slabs of stone that each measure approximately 9 meters in length. Sword immortals also have a special name for these slabs of stone. Dragon slaying platform. Each slab will be worth as much as an entire city." Chen Ping'an fell into deep thought. Ning Yao's eyes suddenly lit up, and she said, "Isn't there a ready-made sword with stone under the feet of that Taoist enforcer statue? It's fairly big, and it looks like we can cleave it into 2 slabs of dragon slaying platform." It was as if someone had lit a flame under Chen Ping'an's bottom, and he hurriedly said, "Ning Yao, we definitely can't break it off and take it home. That Taoist enforcer has already suffered enough. So if we steal its base as well. Ning Yao suddenly stood up, humping coldly and saying, "Steal? Am I that kind of person?" Chen Ping'an followed Ning Yao as she walked up to the statue of the Taoist enforcer. Standing before the colorful statue, Ning Yao took a step forward before placing her hands on her scabbard in a gallant manner. She then looked up and shouted, "I'm Ning Yao. If you're willing to give me your 1 meter wide base today, I'll repay you 100-fold or even 1,000-fold when I become a sword immortal in the future." Chen Ping'an's jaws dropped. Would this really work? Sure enough, the statue remained silent and unmoving. However, Ning Yao didn't give up, and she continued, "So you're not willing to give it to me? Then what about lending it to me? That should be fine, right? I'll make sure to return it to you." Ning Yao didn't forget to turn to Chen Ping'an, blinking and saying, "I'm borrowing it, not stealing it. Understand?" Chen Ping'an furiously shook his head, replying with a sincere expression, "I don't understand." Just as Ning Yao was about to explain the huge difference between the concepts of stealing and borrowing to the stubborn Chen Ping'an, she suddenly heard him shout, "Be careful." As he shouted this, he had already dashed forward to drag Ning Yao behind him. As it turned out, the statue, which had been lashed by the elements for hundreds upon thousands of years, had finally reached the end of its life at this moment. It fell forward and crashed to the ground, disintegrating into pieces. It shattered very comprehensively, and there was not a single piece of it that was still identifiable. In fact, even its head and large beard disintegrated into dust. From the earth it had been sculpted, and to the earth it now returned. Its journey in this world had come to an end. Even more mysterious than this was the fact that the height of the statue was far greater than the distance between the 2 youths and the statue. Logically speaking, this should have resulted in Chen Ping'an and Ning Yao being flattened by the collapsing statue. At the very least, they should have been brutally struck. Interestingly, however, the remains of the collapsed statue only reached as far as the 2 youths' feet. The well-traveled Ning Yao gulped when she saw this, feeling a little guilty. Looking down at the remains by her feet, she mumbled, "How stingy of you, Just say no if you don't want to lend it to me. Is there really a need to sacrifice yourself to attempt to kill me? Chen Ping'an suddenly shook his head, saying, this is called annulling BODHISATTVA. It agreed to your request. Standing shoulder to shoulder with Chen Ping'an, Ning Yao looked at the remains of the statue in front of them, before looking further away at the lonely slab of black dragon slaying platform. In the end, she turned to Chen Ping'an and asked in an uncertain voice, are you sure? Uncertain, Chen Ping'an replied with a smile. Ning Yao believed him, with not even a shred of doubt remaining in her mind. Even she didn't know why this was. Afterward, Ning Yao followed Chen Ping'an's guidance and swept the scattered remains of the statue into a pit that they had dug. They then covered it with a layer of dirt. Chen Ping'an lowered his head and quietly chanted, may you rest in peace, no matter whether you're a human or a god. Ning Yao also lowered her head and quietly said, rest in peace. After doing all this, Ning Yao asked in curiosity, Chen Ping'an, is this a custom of the small town? Is this something passed down by your ancestors? Chen Ping'an shook his head and replied, no, it's not that, it's just something that I came up with. Ning Yao raised an eyebrow. Chen Ping'an smiled and asked, Ning Yao, don't you feel very at ease after doing this? Ning Yao shook her head and replied, no. Chen Ping'an scratched his head. He looked at the black statue base and asked, that's called a dragon slaying platform. MHM martial artists might refer to them as saber whetstones or sword whetstones, and only swordsmen will refer to them as dragon slaying platforms. Ning Yao replied. She turned around to gaze toward the southwest, and she appeared to be in a trance as she said softly, the people in my hometown also refer to them as sword whetstones. Everyone earned a piece, be it big or small. Usually, it would only be the size of a fist. However, there are some swordsmen whose clans have declined and whose cultivation bases are low, so the sword whetstones are only the size of a thumb. Even so, they still value it more than their own lives. My family also has a sword whetstone, a very big piece. How big? Chen Ping'an asked softly. Even bigger than your house in Clay Valley. Ning Yao murmured in reply. Chen Ping'an was astounded. An expression of envy then spread across his face, and he said, Ning Yao, your family is so rich. Moreover, since the sword whetstone is so large, you don't need to worry about others stealing it either. How nice is that? Unlike me. After working hard to earn some money, I feel worried no matter where I hide it. Ning Yao had been feeling slightly sad thinking about her hometown just then, but her sadness instantly vanished at this moment, and she said with a smile, let's split this sword whetstone into two and take half each. Chen Ping'an waved his hands and said, what would I need it for? I do have a machete at home, but that won't require such a valuable piece of saber whetstone. My heart will ache each time I use it. So what's the point? Ning Yao, I reckon you should just take the entire thing. Well, that's right. Didn't you want to ask Master Ruin to forge a sword for you? You can use the other half of the saber whetstone to pay for that. Chen Ping'an, are you genuinely stupid? Or are you scatterbrained? Ning Yao said in exasperation. Chen Ping'an pondered this for a moment before smiling and saying, Ning Yao, just pretend that I'm a foolishly kind person. Ning Yao suddenly pointed at Chen Ping'an, a look of realization on her face. She smiled with squinted eyes and said, Chen Ping'an, be honest with me. Do you have ulterior motives? Are you thinking that everything will still be yours after you make me your wife? How very calculating of you. Very impressive. Chen Ping'an grimaced, and he was truly on the verge of tears at this moment. What was the phrase that Song Jigson said before? He who has a mind to beat his dog will easily find his stick. Ning Yao roared with laughter and exclaimed, I'm just joking. Look at how terrified you became. Chen Ping'an couldn't help but sigh. His mind was truly feeling a little tired at this moment. Ning Yao's expression suddenly became serious, and she said, be careful. My flying sword is already returning. Chen Ping'an suddenly became tense, and it was as if he were facing a great enemy.